On today's World Insight, deal or no deal? After U.S. President Trump meets with South Korean President Lee Myung at the White House, where does the summit leave relations between Seoul and Washington?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The U.S. President Donald Trump met with his South Korean counterpart, President Lee Myung, at the White House on Monday. On that day, reports announced the South Korea companies made a $150 billion investment pledge, which includes plane and ship purchases. At the end of July, a last-minute deal set tariffs on U.S. imports from South Korea at 15%, less than Trump's threat of 25%. Trump told Lee that the U.S. will stick to the July tariff and investment agreements with South Korea. Meanwhile, Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao met on Monday in Beijing with a special envoy of South Korean president. The Chinese Commerce Minister said China is keen on deepening cooperation with South Korea, which is an important neighboring economic and trade partner. For insights on the latest visit by the South Korean president to Washington, D.C., and the complicated relationship in Northeast Asia, let's loop in our panelists. Joining us in Washington, D.C., Jenny Tang, Senior Fellow and Director of Korea Program and 38 North at Stimson Center. In Washington, D.C. as well, Anton Fedashian, Professor of History from American University. In Shanghai, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, professor from East China Normal University. Last but not least, also in Shanghai, Shending Li, former executive dean of the Institute of International Studies and former director of the Center for American Studies with Fudan University. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. Now, President Lee Jae-myung's first visit to Washington, D.C. apparently seems to be a great success. Jenny, you've been watching different administrations coming in and out of Washington. What is your assessment?
Well, it certainly went better than most people had expected, and that this was the big test of what their chemistry was going to be like, given that this is really the first time that the two have met. It's a very different time, though, in terms of how summits are going. You know, President Trump is not the kind of person that's going to have long summits. It was a very short meeting. There's very little you can expect to come out of that. And summits these days don't have joint statements. They don't have agreements that come out of them either. So I think that it got accomplished as much as it could in the time that it was given, but there's still uncertainties in the relationship.
Anton, of course, at the press gaggle in the White House in front of the newly furbished places, President Lee has been generous in his praising toward President Trump, just to say the least. So has that worked?
Well, it certainly looks like it. I guess the best that we can say is that there wasn't a dust-up in the Oval Office the way there was with the Ukrainian president a few months ago. As a matter of fact, I saw reports today about President Lee's team admitting that they were conscious of what had happened between the Ukrainian and the American president, and were somewhat worried that this may happen again. So far, so good. And the South Korean president seemed to play his cards very intelligently. He also, by the way, admitted at a CSIS event that he had spent a good chunk of time preparing for this meeting, and he seems to have read Donald Trump's book carefully and knew how to handle him.
All right. Joseph, in the press gaggle and also in his speech at CSIS later, President Lee seemed to mention several things. Do you think it got across to both his audience in Washington, D.C., and many, of course, he knows, watching around the world, especially in Northeast Asia?
Well, I think interestingly, you know, South Korea is in a very difficult situation right now. So I think on the one hand, we have this perception that South Korea is in a very difficult position trying to bring together several different threads, but at the same time, realizing that it has considerable leverage as it tries to play off or play together or create connections as it moves through these various contradictions.
Professor Shen, tell me more about your assessment observing from China.
Well, before this summit, there is some rhetoric from Washington that the U.S. might be interested in amending U.S. ROK Mutual Defense Treaty. And the U.S. wants South Korea to relax its third kind of control of U.S. security definition, how to apply U.S. military force in the region. Traditionally, that's only confined within the peninsula. But for several U.S. presidents, U.S. tried to expand the definition in order for U.S. military assets to be mobile in the region. China definitely is worried about this.
During the CSIS speech, President Lee from South Korea talking about his discussion with President Trump, not necessarily in front of the camera, as encouraging and also beyond the expectations. Exactly which direction is he suggesting?
I think the overall tone suggested that the meeting went well, that there weren't major dust-ups, and that there is a way forward here, even if we don't have clarity on a lot of the key issues of contention within the alliance. I think that the major discussion and the center point of this summit, despite all the talk about the security conditions, I think the major center point of this conference was actually the trade deal. And certainly Lee Jae-myung came prepared to talk about trade, to talk about investment. He brought key conglomerate leaders with him. And especially, the plans of the build out of shipbuilding, cooperation, all of these things, as well as, the key thing was also really looking at, the potential of this joint U.S. Japan ROK pipeline project, which is something that Trump really wants. And so I think he hit all the right notes on the economic side, which then helped ease some of the other tensions, even if they didn't have resolution this time around.
Yeah. Let's go into some of the details. Tariffs, even after this cordial discussion, at least that's the impression from outside, we haven't seen the tariffs change it at all. What does the current tariff rate for the South Korean economy and exports to the United States?
So I think, the trade deal and the idea that they had a trade deal was announced ahead of the deadline. So this idea that it's going to maintain at 15% is really the goal here, even if we don't have full clarity on what the investment package actually looks like. So I think, again, it's moving in a positive direction. But as we've seen, even with the U.S.-Japan trade deal, it may take a long time to actually figure out what exactly happened, what all the details are, and get it actually on paper in a way that's concrete and can't be taken back. And I think this is one of the ways in which Trump is actually negotiating, is to drag it out as long as possible in order to extract more if he wants to at any given time.
Of course, airplanes, shipping industry, both are important, it seems, in the bilateral trade. Now, Anton, your observation of where things are moving, actually, even during the talk about these important issues.
Well, things are moving in the direction of economic nationalism from the American perspective. There's no question about it. What Donald Trump is doing to all countries, and South Korea is no exception here, is that he is separating countries individually, isolating them, and then bringing the force of the American economy and the trade relationship to use as a lever to bear on basically beating trade deals that are beneficial in his perception for the United States. And the U.S. has trade deficits, which are not in its favor, obviously, with most countries in the world, simply because the American consumer is driving both the domestic and the international economy by buying stuff all over the world. The South Koreans certainly produce an enormous amount of technology and also automobiles, and the American market soaks this stuff up. Let's see what the Trump administration manages to agree with South Korea. But I think it's very telling, by the way, that one of the most important components of the trade negotiation is the American requirement And we'll see how it actually works out. But the American requirement for the South Koreans to actually invest an enormous amount of money in American shipbuilding and essentially to transfer know-how to the United States to reinvigorate its shipbuilding industry.
South Korean president repeated once and again on different occasions that he has read The Art of the Deal, the book by U.S. President Donald Trump before coming into the White House. Now, of course, he also mentioned during his CSIS speech and later Q&A with the American host that he noticed the U.S. has been competing with China in some areas, but also working with China in other areas. So from these words and the strategy he used in his discussion with his American counterpart, how do you see the current administration is trying to keep a balance, especially on the economic and trade issue, which it has very close connection with China over the decades?
President Lee noticed that the relationship between Seoul and Beijing is a comprehensive but complicated one. The two countries work together on trade and economic various aspects, but also they are apprehensive with each other concerning the peninsula's stability, the role of North Korea, how China deals with North Korea's nuclear development. South Korea must have some question that may overlap with that of America. Meantime, U.S. pressed South Korea not to increase its chip investment in China, to press South Korea's normal economic relation with China, which is unacceptable to South Korea. So he need to tell his Washington-based audience that the U.S.-China relationship is not that simple. It's just a confrontational mode. It also has deep cooperation. So the three countries may better understand each other, and the U.S. may not press South Korea in confronting China.
In terms of supply chains, of course, it is Washington's intention to isolate China to a certain extent, even among China's closest neighbors, such as Japan and South Korea. But that means tremendous cost to China's neighbors if they try to provide a China-free supply chain to the United States. So how do you see the current South Korean administration is articulating this during this trip?
Well, I think it was very clear that, South Korea needs to maintain a relationship with China. That, there's no way around it. And so while there's certain aspects that can be, fudged, for instance, the relationship, the closeness of it, the trade relations, there's just no way to actually sever ties. The question really is how much they're going to try and balance that relationship. And I think that's really hard to tell, given how early it is in the Trump administration, to see where the alliance actually goes. And to see also how, China-Japan relations, Japan-U.S. relations also goes, because there is greater incentive now for South Korea and Japan to work more closely together, as there is increasing pressure between U.S. and China to choose two sides.
Joseph, the same question to you.
I think that we did see that they were talking in the direction of de-risking supply chains, which essentially means trying to reduce what people call a reliance on China. But at the same time, we know that Seoul is trying to push forward and normalize ties. This is the term that's been used by Seoul, normalize ties with China after years of frictions. We see the relationship with China moving forward. At the same time, we see sort of these tacit promises that they're going to continue to de-risk from China. And at the same time, to go back to Shin Malsher's point, there is significant concern in Beijing about whether or not South Korea will be more flexible on the rules related to U.S. troops, in so much as there's a concern that the U.S. wants to be able to move those troops into a potential conflict related to Taiwan if such were to arise.
during the interactions on the record between the South Korean president and intellectuals and think tanks in Washington, D.C., there seems to be indication from the American side that it is tremendously important for South Korea to have the deterrence by the United States right now in Northeast Asia. Now, how much do you see that is the urgency demand coming from Seoul? How much do you think it is a voluntary offer for the interests of the U.S. right now, since it's trying to find its balance of security in the region, Northeast Asia?
I think the South Koreans need to weigh their options very carefully.
Yeah.
So from a strictly historical point of view, look, the Korean War is still in effect. There was no peace. There was an armistice, a ceasefire that ended it. And of course, South Korea has to live with a fairly unpredictable northern neighbor, the DPRK. That's number one. Number two, of course, the United States goes out of its way to present China as a universal threat to all of its neighbors in Asia. But for the United States, South Korea, of course, is an added benefit next to Japan because it allows the United States to be involved in Asia. The question for the South Koreans is, what are they going to choose? Are they going to choose the strategic alignment with the United States, with the broad geopolitical benefits that this brings on the one hand, but at the risk of being dragged into conflicts that are simply not in their interest, such as whatever may happen in Taiwan? Or do the South Koreans begin to shift the geopolitical sort of weight towards the other side of the scale, which is pragmatic interaction with their neighbors, and especially with China, given the importance of its economy? I don't know what the South Koreans are going to do. I'd like to think that after the meeting today, the South Koreans will strike a balance between these two.
You know, this pressure to change and expand the mission of the U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula is not new. It is something that the U.S. has wanted for a very long time, but the discourse has been largely behind closed doors. So the idea that they're talking about it more freely, there is certainly more pressure on it. There's some questions about whether that pressure is more as leverage in negotiations and trade negotiations. And, you know, how serious are they about actually wanting to do this, being able to do this and being able to move forward? Because in the past, a lot of the kind of drastic changes to the military posture and military alliance haven't been possible because of political opposition, you know, in Congress and stuff to decisions and pressures from the administration. So I think, you know, when it comes to Lee Jae-myung and the security situation, I think we see some continuity with Yoon's policies and looking at, you know, really trying to balance deterrence, trying to maintain strong deterrence, trying to improve the situation with North Korea also as a counterbalance to that, which does differ from the previous president, Yoon Suk-yeol. But I think, you know, Lee Jae-myung is also very well aware that there's going to be big demands from the United States. And it does create also opportunities for big asks. And you see this when it comes to things like OPCON transition and other kinds of agenda items that the South Koreans want, such as enrichment and reprocessing rights and things that would also increase their security and their own sense of self-security.
We have seen DPRK quite active in interacting with Russia, for example, and also in telling the rest of the world about the increasing capacity of its defense power. So is its nuclear capabilities. So what kind of message do you think the South might be receiving as a result? And how is this interact with U.S. President Donald Trump's apparent, very obvious interest in having a conversation with his DPRK counterpart?
The bottom line, the message from the North Koreans is that they are a nuclear weapon state, a nuclear armed state, and that their nuclear program is here to stay. They've said very clearly they have no interest in negotiations with South Korea, and especially since they've denounced the prospects for peaceful unification. They see, they've said South Korea is a permanent hostile state. But I think, when it comes to where that leaves the relationship with the US, it's a much more nuanced message. And that is the message to Donald Trump has been, hey, there's an opportunity here. Kim Yo-jong made the statement that, there's a reason for two states with nuclear weapons not to have confrontational relations, but it can't be about denuclearization. And so the question really being posed to the US now is there reason to talk to the North Koreans beyond denuclearization? And how will our allies see that conversation? And that's why you see the South Koreans really pushing the denuclearization narrative to keep it front and center on the agenda.
How much do you see South Korea is interested in a trilateral North, South, and the United States? And how much do you see that South Korea, before the South Korean president visit to the United States, already went to Japan, and he's a high-level advisor already in China, interacting with a neighbor? What does this tell us about his possible approach toward the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula?
One of the big dark horse risks that I think some people are talking about, although I don't think it's necessarily realistic, is if we continue to see a nuclear North, and I agree with the fellow panelists that we will, and certainly the developments related to Iran in recent times have reinforced North Korea's commitment to that program. But I would say, just to back up, that I would disagree with the contention that North Korea is unstable. I would say that politically, South Korea has been much more unstable in recent years than North Korea, although we may not like, all of us, North Korean politics or their trajectories. That said, I do think that the North Koreans' nuclear capacity gives them a sense of reassurance that they don't feel so insecure, and they do feel like they can stand up for themselves and protect themselves. And I suspect, despite conventional wisdom, that does bring a level of security to the peninsula. But again, the concern that some people have is that if we continue to see U.S. security commitments in doubt, and I don't think that we do, I think that they just, both sides don't want to resolve it. They want to keep it a little ambiguous. That there are these concerns that South Korea might start rethinking its own nuclear development capability, something that created frictions between South Korea and the U.S. in the 1970s. I don't think that we're going to see that, but it would certainly be something that would raise consternation in China as well as North Korea.
How do you see this interaction might be viewed in Beijing? I mean, since you are in Washington, how people are aware of that factor?
For the most part, people are not aware of that factor. By default, where the relationship between the U.S. and China is going, as is the relationship between the U.S. and Korea and China, is towards regionalism. And that's exactly where the whole world is moving. We're moving into a multilateral international system because the United States can no longer practice the hegemony that it had enjoyed after the end of the Cold War for about 30 years. But it still wants to. And the more it tries to maintain it, the more it will push countries, even such as South Korea, to de-risk not just from China, but also to very intelligently de-risk from the United States and to make themselves parts of multilateral networks where, without in Washington, they cover all their bases. And I think that's the general trend that we're going to be seeing for the foreseeable future.
All nations care their national interest. That includes the economy, political, and security interest. For South Korea, security is number one because they have had some bad memory. For this, they remember Americans' provision of aid during early 1950. And they remember this bad experience could recur in the future, and possibly due to their northern siblings' potential aggressiveness. So need China to speak to North Korea. They need Japan not to allow American force in Japan to be relocated to other region. They need America to reaffirm its bilateral security mutual defense agreement. Therefore, they're willing to pay some cost, to smile, to please America, to read the art of the deal before the meeting. And for business, China is their major friend. And they, for quite some time, they do more business than China than with America and Japan. And they can make more money than they could make from America. So they need to balance. Therefore, when earlier U.S. president demanded South Korea not to sell some sensitive chips to China, they refused. And they are unwilling to receive U.S. House Speaker Pelosi to visit South Korea. Their president at that time to say, I am on vacation. I'm not able to meet with her. So this is their balance between security and business. I think they will continue to play this game. We need to understand, respect, and sympathize South Korea's situation of such.
This president of South Korea, new in his job, certainly made a good impression for Washington and also beyond the Beltway. However, how much stability is at home, given the fact it is still a very divided country, given the fact that he is new in his job?
It is an incredibly polarized public right now. There's growing support for former President Yoon as prosecutions continue looking into his martial law debacle. But there's also high anti-China sentiment. There's some cooperation that's growing between the far right in South Korea and America's MAGA movements. So you have all of these factors at play. And so it's really difficult in that kind of environment for Lee Jae-myung to try and bring a sense of unity back to the country. He's going to have to make some very difficult decisions. They're not going to be popular with everyone. He's going to face a lot of opposition. And so he does have to his battles very carefully.
Right. And later we all understand that South Korea will be the host for the APEC Economic Leaders Meeting. Certainly, the stability and continuity of important policies is crucial for that country and the region as well. On that note, I want to thank our 4 panelists for joining us in this very resourceful discussion. Jenny Tao, Anton Fidashian, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, last but not least, Shending Lee. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us.